I would say that like asking questions is like the fundamental root of philosophy. And then because the types of answers that you give to questions always go back to like how the question is structured, how it's formatted, what you assume.
You are listening to And If Love Remains, a unique show spotlighting people, ideas, science, culture, and art. Your host,
Mike Lovett.
Hi, and welcome to And If Love Remains. I am your host, Mike Lovett, and yes, the doctor is in the house. Dr. Elias Axel Pedersen.
Hey,
welcome. Glad to have you back.
That's a funny intro.
Gotta mess with it once in a while, have some fun. Well, we have a fantastic guest today. We have AJ Matula, who is a podcast host. He hosts the Road to Reason podcast. You can check it out by going to YouTube and just type in the Road to Reason podcast, and AJ's podcast will come up. Welcome to the show, AJ. I'm really glad to have you on today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. And as well as being a podcast host, I'm also a piano student of the doctor himself. So
That's right. It was Elias that said, "Hey, we've got to get AJ on. He's a really smart guy. I think he's starting a podcast, and he's a musician, and it kind of right up our alley. So this will be fun." So AJ, tell us a little bit about yourself. Obviously you worked with Elias, but maybe a little bit about your music background, and then your philosophy background, and the reason that you started your podcast.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll start with music, because at least as an academic pursuit, that has been like the longest going thread in my life. I got my bachelor's degree in music, and I took piano lesson. I've taken piano lessons since I was about 14. And I went to the Crane School of Music, which is in Potsdam, New York, to get my bachelor's in piano performance. And I've studied with a lot of different great teachers. And I met Elias at a summer festival called Adamant. And he was my studio professor, and we got along really, really well. And we had a lot of very, very long, drawn out lessons together, and then continued to study with each other through Skype and Zoom after we finished our time at Adamant together. So that's how I got to know Elias. And that's generally been my very, very baseline kind of fundamental music progression. Like started piano lessons as an early teenager, got my degree in piano, and now I'm kind of independently studying.
Can I just intersperse one little thing here? When AJ was studying piano with me, I feel that I was studying philosophy with him. So we got into these very interesting discussions, and it was great because we got to delve into some of the paradoxes of music. I feel that they're just at the endpoints and the limits of interpretation. You just feel, okay, what was being written, what was meant? Is that possible? Who cares? All those kinds of ideas. So I really enjoyed teaching him and learning from him. So.
And playing cards.
That's right. We did have a lot of fun times at Adamant. Yeah. And I hope I'm sure that will return, and we'll go back in the future. It's a beautiful place in Vermont.
Yeah, it's really amazing.
Yeah. AJ, so where do you live then? Where are you based out of?
Yeah, so right now I live in upstate New York, nearish to the Albany area. And I live in a pretty just mellow suburban area around there. And most of my interactions that are musical these days in terms of like teaching and communicating are online, because my area isn't super, super musically involved. Like there isn't really a symphony nearby or anything. And also like teaching online is easier, not only because of my location, but because of the pandemic and all of that. So
Sure. Mm-hmm. Sure. Okay. And then, so you started this podcast and you wanted to focus on philosophy. So, where did, your interest in philosophy come from? And, what is it about philosophy that intrigues you, and who are some of your, big influences in that realm?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say that philosophy is something that has always been in the background of my life. ever since I was a kid. And all I mean by that is I was a super annoying kid who asked a lot of questions about stuff all the time.
Why? But why?
Yeah, well, exactly. Yeah, when I went on a diamond mine expedition when I was like in the first grade with some of my friends, like I bombarded our tour guide with questions. Oh, why do the diamonds look like this? Oh, why they come from here? Oh, why are some bigger than others? And like at the end of it, like every single kid like won some award for something. And like I won the like scientist award for asking the most questions, when in reality that definitely meant like I was the most annoying kid there. So I would say that like asking questions is like the fundamental root of philosophy. And then because the types of answers that you give to questions always go back to like how the question is structured, how it's formatted, what you assume when you're about to answer something. So like asking questions, and like I would say that like for many years at least, like being a pianist was like the foreground of my life, but like philosophy has always been the background of my life. It's always like I feel like I was a like philosopher who used piano as an extension for philosophizing. You know, like piano always felt very interconnected with like asking questions about, you know, reality in a way that's more metaphysical, that like can't be maybe, you know, satisfactorily answered by a scientific domain like physics, for example, which has its own important things to say about reality. But philosophy connects particularly well with music. One of the reasons why being the fact that instrumental music, at least, is not directly representational of the world in the same way that language is, for example. Like we can use language to denote concepts or other, like refer to specific things, like in a generalized way or a more specific way. And in music, music has certain like parallels to language. For example, the fact that it can be broken up into different like groups, like phrases, is akin to like different linguistic structures, like sentences exist, for example. But on a more specific basis, music is something that's it actually generates what I would say, it generates feelings from us, and it generates thoughts from us that are not actually representing what like music is actually referring to, but like creating pockets of meaning for us.
Right.
So I have an interesting thought. You mentioned language as being, you know, general or specific. A couple things come to mind. One is, just for fun, I've looked up different videos on YouTube about difficult languages. And there happens to be one that's extremely difficult and was created by somebody to basically encompass all possible ideas and meanings of whatever it is, whatever word. So in English, you know, we might have a word that has many meanings depending on how you say it or in what context it's used. And this language that was created was trying to circumvent that and just say, okay, there's one word that represents one idea, and you know, with different inflections, and trying to borrow from all languages of the world. But it's very difficult, and nobody actually speaks it. And I don't even know if that's possible, because you can keep going down that rabbit hole. So that's one thought to mull over and maybe, you know, respond to. And the other thought is what Mendelssohn said. I always remember, and I just had to bring it up because I couldn't remember how he said it. But his quote is, so people often complain that music is too ambiguous, that what they should think when they hear it is so unclear, whereas everyone understands words. With me, it is exactly the opposite, and not only with regard to an entire speech, but also with individual words. These two seem to me so ambiguous, so vague, so easily misunderstood in comparison to genuine music, which fills the soul with 1,000 things better than words. The thoughts which are expressed to me by music that I love are not too indefinite to be put into words, but on the contrary, too definite. So I always read that and felt so interesting, because especially when we teach, we don't really have a way to directly exemplify or model maybe the music into language or put it into words. You know, so we give a lot of imagery, like, oh, well, this part could be like a waterfall or whatnot. And so Mendelssohn's basically saying a waterfall could mean many things to different people, whereas the music means the same thing, which I don't necessarily agree with. I think it's very cultural, but I don't know. I'm just kind of ranting on here. I wonder if you have thoughts.
I think, and just I would just want to jump in, and then I definitely want to hear AJ. But you know, a lot of times it's you know, language is like symbol to me. Like I think of language, and it's like the symbol of what we're trying to express. You know, it's not the thing; it's the symbol of the thing. Where music, you know, is the thing, and sometimes we mistake music as trying to express something when it's really that is the thing that is like that we should be talking about, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah, self-encapsulated almost.
Yeah, well, that's exactly what I was thinking, is that music is extraordinarily self-contained. And well, the thing about language is that it has a really, really interesting quality of being simultaneously self-contained and simultaneously overflowing itself, like as like a reference point into the world. And what I mean by that is just that there are two ways that you can define a thing, and these concepts come from semantics. And there is what's called intentional language usage, and it's not the same type of intentional that with a T, but it's actually with an S. INTENSION.
Okay.
And then there's extensional language, and they're both ways of describing how words can be defined. And intentional language is defined in terms of its logical relationship to other words. It's much more of it's almost a mathematical and deductive way of defining words. For example, we say that if a man is unmarried, then he's a bachelor, because like being unmarried is contained within the definition of being a bachelor. For example, you have to assume correlations between definitions at first, but then you can build a system of definitions that are like all interlinked with each other. And then extensional language is defining something in terms of all of the possible objects in the world that term could refer to, or like abstractly put into a bucket. So you could define bachelor in terms of being unmarried and create a logical relationship between those two, which may lead to other deductions, for example. Or you could define it in terms of saying, okay, we are just going to create like a set of every single unmarried man in the entire world and say like all of those people fall under the definition of bachelor. And each of them have different qualities, like advantages, maybe disadvantages. Like intentional language usage is really, really self-enclosed, which makes it really, really like satisfactory and a good tool for linguists to use who are more interested in like logical relationships between different like words or lexical units in any given language. But extensional definitions more so get to the way that we actually pragmatically use language in the world, because we usually use language not to create inevitable logical implications between different words, but we actually use words to access material that's outside of language,
right?
For example. So that I think that those two concepts give an idea that like language is actually this very language itself is a very forked tongue, in the sense that there are two major ways in which language can be used to define entities, and they're incompatible, and yet they also live together. So it's a paradox within language, and I think music has similar qualities too.
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
That's wild.
Yeah.
And yeah, so talk about that. Like what music as maybe if we think of music as a way of expressing ourselves, I mean, because there is this kind of tug between, and Elias and I have talked about this a lot, the tug between composer and the music itself, and who really owns the music, you know, once it's out in the world, like what does that even mean, and how people can when they hear it, you know, what do they
what do they experience?
What do they experience with it?
Composers in a way, and is the performer a composer in a way?
And even a bigger question, like why does it move us? Like why is music moving to us in such a really almost earthly or guttural way. Like there's something about music, rhythm, tone, timbre, that harmony that uniquely is human in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that I would say that music is a self-contained structure, for example, like a musical piece. If we were to give like an intentional definition to musical content, that it would be purely what we would think of as theoretical. For example, like how is the composition structured? What are the notes? What meter is it in? For example, all the
Right.
self-evident relationships that are actually contained within the score, or even the like physics. You could even use physics to examine like the sonic properties of that piece, like and recording, for example, as it became actualized auditorially, and then you could give an extensional definition to music, which is what type of experiences does music generate for us outside of the musical content itself. And I think that as musicians, we tend to be especially as performers, we tend to be very, very interested. And I think what would be the extensional like quality of music,
Right.
What do we get out of it that isn't necessarily contained within it itself?
Well, and that gets into like I was thinking about like the new complexity school of music, and how in a way like it's morphed into what is on the page and then the interpretation of what's on the page, and versus what's actually being heard. And it's almost taking music and turning it on its head where it's in, and it's interesting. I don't know how much I like that idea, but it's an interesting thing to think about for sure. Is like there's so much on the page that you have to like take stuff away, and it becomes this kind of interpretive dance that happens between composer and audience and the music itself.
Yeah, I would say that actually I think it's really cool that you brought new complexity up, because I think that particularly Brian Ferneyhough's string quartets are some of my favorite contemporary pieces of music. I think that they're really amazing. And I think that new complexity in particular shows what happens when we condense something that has one form into such a small self-contained pocket that it almost creates the illusion of not being anything like what it was previously. And to give a concrete example of that, so many of the intervallic relationships and the like melodic contours of different lines in Brian Ferneyhough string quartets are actually extraordinarily influenced by Romanticism. Like if you pick apart different sections, you can find a lot of like Brahms and Mahler, for example, and like early Schoenberg in his string quartets. But what happens is it would be his music is the equivalent to what if the Big Bang happened in reverse? What if the universe as it exists now condensed back into like a single molecule or a single particle of matter? And that's kind of what his music does, is it takes an extraordinarily open musical space and it condenses it so much into like very, very thick textured parts that you don't even see the resemblance anymore, and it actually becomes like aesthetically to most pretty unpleasant to listen to.
Yeah, it's kind of a kernel. You've got the kernel of everything in there. I've never heard it described as the Big Bang in reverse. And for those listeners who haven't heard of Brian Ferneyhough or haven't seen his music, it's extraordinary. You can't even see it on the page. It's almost like black music. I mean, where it's just filled,
right? Like black MIDI.
Black MIDI. It's almost it's almost there, where there's so much going on just to interpret. And I'll probably never play a score of his. Just to interpret how to play it and what's actually being written is a task in and of itself. And actually, on this topic, it brought up the idea that in every generation of composers and eras, if we talk about eras, we do sort of have this roller coaster where we go in and out of complexity versus simplicity. And, one great example is the end of the Baroque, when things were at its height, terms of complexity with late Bach and things like that. And then we get into the early classical with his son CPE and Mozart and Haydn, with everything being pared down to the most simple, at least in their time with their musical language, simple forms of melody and accompaniment. So we have that going on. At the same time, we seem to have an increase in composer control, I guess one could say, and what the composer wants the performer to do, and maybe even wants the audience to listen for. And so back in Bach's day, and all those composers, they didn't really indicate a lot of things, at least for keyboard, partly because there was no piano. We've had podcasts on that development, but dynamics weren't indicated. A lot of other things weren't put in. And then you get to somebody, not even 100 years later, like Beethoven, who tried to control as much as he could and put in all the indications, because he had a very specific idea of how the music should sound and be taken in by the listener. And even compared to the types like Schoenberg you mentioned, and Beethoven is nowhere near that same level of complexity and I guess the amount that he's putting in, the amount of directions that he's putting in the score don't really compare. And so you get to I'm doing a huge survey here and a lot of thoughts. I don't know if there are questions in here, but you get to someone like John Cage, who tries to remove himself from what we always consider that holy trinity, triangle, if you will, the performer, composer, and audience. And he tried to remove himself. I'm not sure if he actually did. And I feel he's one of the great philosopher composers. So I don't know, with all those thoughts, I wonder if you want to talk about any of that.
Yeah. I think that you make a really good point that there seems to be like a pattern throughout cultural art forms and history, that they tend to ebb and flow between periods of relative complexity and periods of relative simplicity. Even around that era with John Cage, I think about the oscillation between minimalism and then serialism, for example, which are like two forms of music that couldn't be any more different from each other. But yeah, I actually haven't done a ton of research on John Cage in terms of, because I know he actually wrote a couple of books, neither of which I've read. But one thing I find particularly interesting about Cage's music is he reminds me a lot of Beethoven, and I think he might actually have this quality even more of being a creative mind that was constantly ripping itself in half. And what I mean by that is he was constantly going between doing things like, for example, random chance music and then complete determinism, for example. He, as a creative agent, he really embodied and personified living as a paradox. And that comes through in just his output in general, and even within a lot of his pieces. I love my favorite piece by him is the sonata for prepared piano. I love that piece.
Yeah, I performed well. So one thing is that surprised me is I got a volume of his early compositions, and it almost sounds like a minimalist extension of Debussy. So that surprised me.
Oh, interesting.
And then another thing is, I also performed in one. I can't say I really performed his work or a work, but I was part of a performance of a work that involves so many moving parts, including some pre-recorded stuff. This was when I was at Banff, which was just a wonderful opportunity for artists. And the program that I was in, it no longer exists, unfortunately. But there was a huge collaboration between the music program there and the recording engineering program. And there was a piece where there are a lot of pre-recorded language, poetry sections or little tidbits here and there in different languages. And I recorded something in Hebrew. And then there were, in the actual performance, the audience was instructed to sit in the middle of the hall. It was done in a sort of a black box. And then there were all these different booths, if you will, musical booths around the perimeter with different instruments. There were different smells being emitted with what are those, like scented candles, and there were sounds that were being emitted from recordings. It was just a hodgepodge of everything. And there were people at some of those stations that were supposed to perform or do whatever they wanted. And within each of those stations, it was like another musical composition that was sometimes aleatoric and sometimes deterministic. And then the audience was instructed to, if they wanted, partake in some of the booths or musical little centers, and then everybody just kind of could move around, and it lasted for an hour. And whatever was done or seen or recorded or smelled or heard or felt, that was the composition. It was a very strange experience, and I'm obviously never going to experience that again. But yeah, it was pretty cool to take.
Yeah, I think being part of one of those ensembles would be like kind of a special experience, that's because it's definitely so outside of the daily norm, getting to participate in something like that. What about you, Mike? Do you like contemporary music, and do you have any experiences with performing it or anything like that?
I don't really. I mean, let me tell you this.
You improvise and play jazz.
Yeah. So I guess define contemporary. I very much am a jazz rock guy. I love my Beethoven. I love my Bach.
But also Led Zeppelin.
But I grew up on Led Zeppelin, Rush, and Dream Theater. So. And so I do enjoy that. And I love like the big picture of where music is going. I and I've talked to Elias about this. I really fell in love. My first experience with contemporary, I guess, I don't know what you call it. Concert music, let's call it that. Was really, listening to John Luther Adams and his Bean series. Yeah, you knew I was going there.
Yeah,
because
awesome.
I think it was such an experience like none other, where I could listen to it and I felt like I understood like what the music was trying to do. And obviously it's very like, it's meant to be ocean. It's meant to be desert, that is the meaning of the music. And so, but to create sounds that took me to those places was quite an experience. And so from there, I've enjoyed, listening and kind of with new ears. That gave me kind of new ears, if you will. And but I do love, like I love jazz, and I love where contemporary jazz is going. I love playing and improvising. I think the idea of music in the moment is like what Elise was talking about with the piece that he was performing in. I mean, those kinds of experiences are one of a kind, and it kind of brings back to like it forces me to think about like, all right, so what's the meaning of this? Like, what is the meaning of music? What am I experiencing? And why is this affecting me? How is this changing my life? Because for me, it is a very much life-changing. Music is a life-changing thing. Like when I hear it, it moves me to action. It moves me to thoughts that I didn't have before. It's almost a prophetic experience for me. And so, that's kind of my experience with music and especially contemporary music and what that, so that immediacy, that idea of like performing in the moment and the danger of it is exciting for me.
Yeah, definitely. And I feel that in that vein of, you feel like music is something that, changes you as you experience it. I think that refers to a really important quality of music. And to me, I think it's one of the most, if not the most important quality of music, which is that it plays the role of materializing time for us. Time is such an abstract idea, and we usually think about it in terms of linear units, like, ticks and seconds, minutes, hours, what have you. But music is actually something that materializes time in a more substantial way that doesn't simply measure things, but actually generates like new experiences of time and allows us to relate like pockets of like temporal ranges,
Oh, that's beautiful.
to
Yeah.
a very particular experience. Like when I listen to Rachmaninoff's third piano concerto, and if you hear someone listen to something like that, a 45-minute piece, and say that they feel like they've experienced an entire lifetime while listening, there's a way in which they're not actually just saying jargon, but they're actually being truthful in that, because of the fact that music is something that accesses our memories and it promotes nostalgia for our past and hope for our future and the types of feelings that we have about our present. And in a way, music does, in a similar way to how I was talking about Brian Ferneyhough's music condensing something down into a very small region. I feel that musical experience in general tends to compress everything about our lives into like one space and redefines it.
There's a composer, and I was just trying to look it up really quickly. And it's terrible. I can't remember who did it. But he put together a series of 6 albums that was very moving to me. And it's almost disturbing. Like it may be the most, I don't know how to even say this, because it's like musical horror in a way. Because what he did is he took people through like a life cycle, and it's something called memory lapse, or through a life cycle of somebody with Alzheimer's.
Okay.
And so the first album was kind of nostalgic sounding music, kind of it was nothing out of the ordinary. And then the second one, you could just hear it was the same thing, but a little degraded, and it would just, each album progressively got more degraded, more abstract, more. Literally by the time I was literally by the time I was at the end of it, I was having just these unbelievable feelings of dread, because I was thinking of, is this what people are experiencing with
I need to hear that. I'm very curious.
Yeah,
it was absolutely insane, and then the final album, it was almost like you could tell it was kind of a death's door album, because it was very abstract, but you would hear like glimpses of the music from the first album coming back in and out, and it was just so surreal, and such a it really gave, honestly, it gave me such empathy for people I couldn't, I don't think anything else could.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the beautiful parts of art, is it takes abstract experiences and materializes them into something that's somehow recognizable to other people. And your description of the piece actually reminds me of an extraordinarily famous composition that I'm sure it actually took inspiration from in some way. And it's called Sitting in a Room by Alvin Lucier. And the piece is literally a looped recording of a person sitting in a room and reciting a monologue of some sort. And what happens is that every single new iteration of the monologue is a re-recorded version of it. And what happens is, I think it goes, somewhat like 30 times or something like that. And by the very end of it, it is just completely unrecognizable. And it's noise. And that aspect of, I think that aspect of replication correlating with degradation over time and decay is a concept that I'm really, really fascinated with. And it's something that we call decay because of the fact that we have a certain set of parameters that we use to examine what it means for something to have a particular quality, and the way we differentiate between originals of things and copies of things, when in reality you can actually listen to Sitting in a Room by Alvin Lucier, and you can get yourself in a mental space where you actually just hear it as like different transformations between sound types. Whereas when you get to the end of it, instead of listening to a decayed version of the original monologue, you could actually take that and turn it into a completely new piece. And if someone else didn't know that it was actually based on this old recording and they didn't have that reference point, they would experience it completely differently.
Well, and you see that sort of thing. Like it's funny. Like I think about even with modern DAWs and modern music that people can do, and like grain table manipulation and stuff. Like you can take a sound, any sound from one thing, and turn it into something completely different, and where it's the same exact sound, but now you've transformed it into something that is new and exciting, and it's almost like it's resurrecting that decay in a way.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think that is the most important component and the most important reason why creating music with computers is like a really important aspect of our musical generation right now. I think like algorithmically generated composing is something that's really, really important for that reason, because you can manipulate sound in ways that are extraordinarily precise and create different sonic structures, if you will, that differ strongly and do things that more organic modes of sound generation are incapable of producing.
You kind of turn that whole argument almost on its head. and I feel we're getting into some deep things, Matrix-y and meaning of life stuff. But the idea that a machine or something, or just generating something from an algorithm or an equation, I mean, that's kind of what serialism did, is not somehow human or not really lifelike or musical. And yet you're saying that's almost imperative right now to use computers and all that. But it's so interesting. And the other thing I was thinking about with the degradation, or at least from our perceived vantage point, I remember you or some others at Banff took a picture of a picture of a picture. And this whole
I was thinking of that actually.
Yeah, this whole concept of, an MP3, for example, being a condensed version of a piece. And so you want it in the WAV file. And every time you copy it, you lose a little bit of, I mean, it's negligible, you lose a little bit of clarity. And this also takes me just to connect to life, the idea of, the fountain of youth and that elusive thing. How do we continue to go if we keep degrading? We're from the moment we're born, we're on our path to death. And I don't want to be too morbid here, but I remember when I was studying bio, I was looking at, I did a course in genetics, and one of the main things and one of the I guess focuses that some researchers have looked at to prolong life is telomerase. We have these telomeres at the end of our DNA, which after each replication in our cells gets cut. And our bodies are designed in such a way that there's so much extra non-essential DNA at the end of our double helices that can be cut every replication cycle, and it's okay. But at some point it gets into some very important DNA. And so how do we extend life? Maybe extend the telomeres in all of our DNA and all of our cells, which is obviously sort of impossible to do. But the concept that it's there and that we could somehow live forever without degradation or without change.
You're right. What would be the consequences of that?
Yeah. And it's just cool. Like, I wonder if music, you're talking about music being a representation of life or a condensation of it, like the Rachmaninoff's Third Piano Concerto, which, side note for everybody out there, AJ plays and quite well. But if that could be, that 45 minutes is like a little glimpse into the life, a personal life of whomever is listening to it. I love that concept. And it also brought up, now I'm just riffing here, but brought up the idea that every experience, is different somehow, but then there's maybe a qualitative or quantitative, I don't know, difference between differences. So what I mean is, if you perform the same piece, and we talk about this with interpreting a particular piece, every time you perform it, it's going to be a little different. Even if you try to do exactly the same thing, even if you were to get a computer to replicate it, it's going to be in a different space. People are going to listen to it with different ears. Maybe somebody's had a different lunch one day and hears it differently. So every single experience, everything in our lives is an experience. Even if it's an exact duplicate, is not. It's still unique. And so then maybe the whole concept of unique doesn't matter. It kind of breaks apart in its, on its own, sort of. So I don't know what you think about that. Or those things.
I think that it's completely true that in a very non-trivial way, that even in cases where you're able to create complete duplicates, that there are always differences. And the reason for that is because of the fact that I think that experience is always synthesis between an object and a subject, a human and the thing the human experiences. And because of that fact, because there's that like twofold relationship that's synthesized into one experience, it's almost like you can almost think of it as something like a function in math, where a piece of music is a function and a human being can be an input, for example. And even if the function is the exact same, for example, you put a different person through that, and what ends up coming out at the other end of the region of that piece of music that person accesses is going to be completely different,
right?
Because they've functioned as a different input, for that particular experience. So I think that, and I think that as human beings are not only different from each other in terms of what types of relationships they can have to different experiences and different like materials, but human beings are also constantly changing themselves, which can radically alter how they experience material,
Well, and also we can communicate to each other in a way so I can, the three of us can experience something at the same time, even experience different things, and then through communication we can then, I guess, experience that again, not just the same way, but with new eyes. And we can kind of we just having this conversation, for example, gives me a new take on certain pieces and certain things I need to look at. And so when I listen to those things, I'm going to be hearing it with completely different ears than I would have, 40 minutes ago. And that's another kind of unique and exciting thing that we kind of bring to the table.
Definitely. Communication is always altering the parameters that we use. Like, it adjusts them so that we can perceive the phenomenon differently. But the really fun thing about it too is that we're so unpredictable, and we can't know exactly how what we'll experience may affect what we listen to or what we look at later on. So there's this aspect in which once you have that conversation and you go listen to that piece of music afterwards, it's going to be a real moment of discovery, because you can't anticipate what's going to come out of it,
Yeah, that's that which makes it exciting, because that's true. Like if so I just explained it. By the way, the name of the series of albums is called Everywhere at the End of Time. It's by a recording by the Caretaker, who is Leland Kirby. So I just kind of explained this to you. If I could explain that perfectly in maybe a perfect digital form, you wouldn't have to experience it, because you would already understand it. But now because of how we're built, now you can go and experience it, and you could say, oh, that was a great piece, or I got this out of it, or I just saw this. We can talk about movies and even be spoiled in movies, and we can still experience that same movie, that same experience, and have a different even more enriching experience with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it brings up the question of, is it even possible, for example, to give an explanation of something that is the thing itself? Because an explanation of a thing is always something that connects to the phenomena. It's always referential.
Or would we even want that? Like, would that even be desirable?
Exactly, because probably the most pure digital representation of that album you could give me would to be if you could end up converting it into machine code and then showing me the binary output, for example, of it. But then I would look at that and I wouldn't have any kind of experience at all, other than maybe some confusion or a little bit of annoyance that you would go through such a process to do that to me.
No, exactly. That is brilliant.
There's a way in which we translate between different phenomena, and we think that translations have to be similar because they're mappings from one thing to another thing. But what the in-between stuff, what filters you put translations through completely change what the essence of the material actually is, which always makes me which makes me think that, you can take any kind of material whatsoever and create some sort of function to generate some new material out of it. And I mean, that's what creativity is. I think.
And what that does is it's both creative and destructive at the same time. And I'm thinking about and I don't really necessarily want to go down this path, but I think it's an important thing that people can relate to. Like, if you think about scripture and you think about let's talk about old texts in general, and you do a translation of an old text. Well, what does that old text say? That old text, maybe it literally says that, but is that really what the author is trying to say? Because they have different experiences, they have different language. Like, what does that mean? Well, it really means this. And so you end up having a game of telephone of ideas that kind of translate. And so we only get, even with the greatest translations, it's still not the thing. And that, of course, it comes up in scripture a lot. That's where the context that I use it in, but it comes up in all sorts of ways. And with music, I could see that very much so. And we talk about this, what did Beethoven really mean? What did he want to hear when he wrote that piece of music down? And was that desirable compared to what we hear today?
Yeah, it's one of those. It's one of those interesting veins in which, as creative people, we tend to be obsessed with the purity of the ideas of different figures, and we want to know, quote unquote, what they intentionality is extraordinarily important. When the fact is that creativity is produced through misinterpretations in a lot of ways. Right. It's the fact that Beethoven, not only it wasn't unintentional, it wasn't a mistake, but he took some structures from Haydn and Mozart, for example, and augmented them to extents that would be completely unreasonable to either of them, by experimenting with register and extending harmonies, for example, and using, for example, mediants as a way to organize a macro section within an sonata rather than as some kind of local harmony. Creativity happens by taking the purity of people's ideas, making them impure and then making them pure for yourself again.
There's a great saying in jazz, and a lot of people know it, and it's that if you make a mistake, just play it again, and then it's not a mistake. And what's funny about that is that's literally well, it's right, but it's literally true. If you hit a wrong note and then you purposely hit that wrong note again, then that really wasn't a mistake. It ends up being that mistake becomes the pure idea that you just came up with.
I think there's a little difference, maybe because of the medium or the expectations of the genre in jazz versus, Western
Right.
classical art music. So the wrong note thing might not fly, but there are other parameters that I think can. And I always think about a master class. I think it was with Shandor at IU a long time ago. I mean, this is before my time, where somebody was playing the E minor prelude of Chopin, which is one of the first Chopin pieces anybody plays, really. And most piano students have gone through that. And for whatever reason, maybe the performer wasn't used to the piano or something like that, and they started it out a little too loud for their taste. Objectively, if we can put an objective marker on dynamics, like that's so many hertz, which you really can't. That's one thing I love about dynamics, is that they're relative; they're not
Right.
objective. But what happened was, immediately after playing too loudly the first note or two, and this has come to me, this is already a second or third hand account, the performer got very quiet, and went back to the piano that was indicated. And afterwards, Shandor said, well, you can't do that, because then it sounds like a mistake, and it also sounds like they're disconnected. The beginning's disconnected from the rest of the piece. And so I said, if you start that way, continue on in that vein and try to get back to where you want to get back to, in an organic, which is such an elusive concept too, in an organic way. And I just thought, wow, what a cool thing. You can kind of misinterpret, but then reinterpret, and then that's your interpretation. And it might not be correct, whatever that means, but at the moment it works. And I always think about that when we play. And I think I'm very attuned to the audience when I play, and so that I'm not replicating what I always do, but I try to gauge where their ears are at and where their attention lies. And if I can do something in the music that would change that, that's still true to the music and true to my interpretation of it, but bring their ears back in, if that makes
Absolutely. sense. Yeah, and I mean, classical music as a performance art specifically is more representational, I would say, than something like composing, because part of performance is not only about trying to find new ways to do things, but there's actually a really fundamental quality of being a performer that involves having a particularly kind of sacred respect for history, for example, and bringing history into the present for new people to experience. And part of that is preserving some sort of fundamental structure, right? Which in classical performance would be, for example, making sure you're playing the right notes and the right rhythm, based on the elements of the score, for example. But I think that classical music as a composing tool, even knowing what the foundation is, like qualitatively, might even be harder there than in something like performing, where at least you have the really rigid baseline of making sure that you conform to some sort of representational parameters, being the score in whatever sense.
Yeah, wow. This is cool. I feel like we're just taking a moment to take it in.
I'd like to. I need to bring back up. We're talking to AJ Matula, who has an. I am really looking. I honestly haven't checked out his podcast yet, but I will today, because this has been such a fascinating discussion. His podcast is called The Road to Reason. You can check it out on YouTube. Just put in, just type in the search, The Road to Reason, AJ, and I'm sure it's one of the first ones that will pop up. What kind of things are you trying to do? And by the way, if you don't mind, I'm just going to put you on the spot here. We got to have you on to talk more about this, because this has been so much fun.
Yeah, of course.
That'd be great.
I'd love to. Yeah, I'm having a great time.
I'm glad to hear that. What are you trying to accomplish with your podcast? What should people expect?
Yeah, my goal is to create a space for people to think about philosophically related topics in a way that can be appealing to them wherever they're at in their studies. For anyone, whether someone is interested in philosophy because they just read the Wikipedia article on it and they think that it's cool, or someone who is doing a degree in it, for example, I want to do my best to create material that could at least be interesting to anyone, regardless of how much they actually know about the topic, with the condition that they just have some sort of interest. And someone who's not interested will never end up finding it. So I don't have to worry about people who aren't interested. So like, for example, in my podcast, I typically try to create like scaffolding level of questions, where some of the questions are really, really fundamental and attuned to more basic things. And then I'll have a couple questions that are something like really, really specific about that person's work, for example. Much more like micromanaging or picky, for example. And then I have like more broad and general topics. So I would say that my goal is, in doing the podcast, is to just make philosophy more accessible to anyone, in the same kind of way that physicists right now are having a lot of success writing books about physics for the public that don't utilize a lot of higher math and are much more analogical in terms of the presentation of ideas, because that gives everybody an opportunity to participate. So I kind of want to just create an opportunity for everyone to participate in philosophy in some way, because I think it's an important discipline.
Well, and I wanted to ask you, because I think it's important to and maybe this is where it would be a good place to finish on. Why is it important? Like, a lot of people might hear us discussing this kind of esoteric kind of ideas and these metaphysical thoughts, and think of it as maybe navel gazing or whatever. Like, why is having a basic understanding of philosophy, maybe formal philosophy might be a good way to say it, why is that an important thing to people kind of have in their toolbox?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I feel like we could probably take up another hour just talking about that, but I'll try not to be super annoying and give a brief, succinct answer as best as I can. I think that philosophy, I'll speak in terms of my personal life. There's no tool in my life that has been better at getting me out of damaging thought loops than philosophy, to be completely practical, whether like intellectually or emotionally, because philosophy is all about questioning the fundamental assumptions at the lowest level of any different and a specific type of phenomenon. And usually scientific revolutions in of themselves are philosophical, in the sense that what happens is that there's some particular thinker or figure who decides to say that some past collection of information about some given phenomenon actually isn't true, or isn't true under some conditions, and they create a new system to accommodate that. So for example, like Albert Einstein took Newton's physics, for example, and said, oh, this is actually not really, really applicable to how matter that's moving at the speed of light operates, for example. And then relativity happened, and that was what actually a famous philosopher named Thomas Kuhn calls a paradigm shift. And a paradigm shift is when the most basic questions that have to do with anything whatsoever are up for grabs all of a sudden, and they aren't self-evident anymore. And there's no field or no discipline in the world that makes that more apparent than philosophy, because philosophy is about that, the most basic elements of the most basic assumptions in a particular region of thinking. And it's always when I'm practicing, or when I'm writing or reading, thinking about a problem, or even if I'm having a personal problem, like in my relationship with a person, where I'll take a step back and say, well, what am I assuming about this situation? And like, what could I change about the way I'm thinking, or the way I'm doing this, or the way I'm interpreting this, to completely shift my viewpoint kaleidoscopically? And for me, philosophy has been the like number one go-to for achieving that in my own life. I would say that when it comes to like getting better at playing piano, for example, if I'm struggling with some kind of technique, I will get into a mindset where I assume that all of the technique that I had built up to that point is wrong for the sake of experimentation. And I will start just doing things that are completely wacky, like playing with like really, really different fingerings, or like playing with like my arm at an angle that I kind of think is stupid at like initially, but like I'll give it a shot because I'm allowing everything in my life as a musician at that moment to be up for grabs. And those are the moments where I actually have the breakthrough. And I'm like, oh, this is what I was doing that was hampering me from playing this passage in this way, for example. And when I just simply add this, then I'm able to play it in the way that I want. So
that's
awesome.
that. I can't think of a better endorsement for having you back on and talking about the basics of philosophy.
Yeah, so, I'd love to.
That's wonderful. Well, I want to thank you. And Elias, once again, you were right, man. You bring up the best guests.
He's smart.
He is. He is. Absolutely. Thank you, AJ. Really appreciate you having you on. This is AJ Matula, and his podcast again is The Road to Reason podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much.
You are listening to And If Love Remains.